Of course, this is also a very specific event which led to me entering the public sphere, a genocidal war. If we don't get worked up and emotional about genocide, then who are we?
You're listening to the Transformative Podcast, brought to you by the Research Center for the History of Transformations at the University of Vienna.
Welcome to the newest episode of the Transformative Podcast. My name is Yannis Panagiotidis and I'm the Scientific Director of RITSET. This week we bring you the beginning of our latest Transformative Salon, a conversation between myself and Dr. Franziska Davies, in which she explored the question whether historians have a responsibility to engage in public and political discussions. How can one balance the role of a public intellectual, an activist, and a scholar? And how does one navigate social media in times of disinformation campaigns and tech oligarchy? Dr. Davies is an assistant professor of Eastern European history at Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich and is currently a visiting fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. She specialises in the modern history of Ukraine, Poland and Russia and has been a prominent advocate of the Ukrainian cause on social media since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. If you're interested in the whole conversation, you can find it on our YouTube channel.
So I thought, because this is a nice and informal setting, I think it's the first time I've been on a podium where I'm allowed to have a glass of wine, that I'll keep it a little informal and just talk about what kind of happened to me. Of course, I had something to do with it, so not without agency, but maybe that is also something we can talk about, because I've also had the experience that you send something out there on social media and then it turns into something that was not exactly planned. And it even happens if you consider yourself a kind of person who's not completely naive about social media. So I'm a historian of Eastern Central Europe, so especially Russia and Ukraine. Also do a bit of Polish history. I'm working on a book right now about the end of the Soviet Union from a Ukrainian-Polish perspective. And I suppose the first time I felt the urge to step out of the academic sphere was actually when Russia attacked Ukraine in 2014. Because that's the first time I really noticed, and maybe that also already says something about our discipline, just how Russocentric and, in a way, colonial German images of Ukraine were. And it just made me annoyed. I was just annoyed about it. One of the first thing I did actually was to write letters to the editor. And then my husband at some point said to me, can you stop writing these stupid letters to the editor and write a proper article, essay? And maybe also typical for an academic, possibly also typical for a female academic. I said, because at that point I was working on my dissertation, which was dedicated to 19th century Russian imperial history. I had done a bit of work on Crimeas, and then the Crimean Tatars and specifically, so I knew that this whole Crimea has always been Russian is just false. But I kind of said to him, I don't know. You know, I'm a PhD student and I don't know that much about modern Ukraine. I'm not sure that would be good if I pretended to know more than I do. But then he had this great argument, because he said back to me, I think you know more than Jakob Augstein. And Jakob Augstein maybe the Germans probably know him, as a journalist who also became a well-known Germanist because his father was the founder of Der Spiegel. And he had a monthly columnist at that point at Spiegel Online, which I would read every Monday, and I would get worked up about it every time. And so my husband basically says, so there's this guy, and he's talking loads about Ukraine, NATO, and Russia, and he absolutely knows nothing, and you're too scared to kind of write something from your perspective. So I did a little blog article, and then actually kind of ironically, my first bigger text, I think, was a very negative review of a former German journalist turned pro-Russian propagandist, Gabriele Krone-Schmalz, called Russland verstehen, who would 7 years later take me to court. So also not planned. Also, the first experience at this point was that if you're at that stage, there's also a lot of gatekeeping in the media. So I think I wrote 10 journals and newspapers before one decided to let a junior PhD student write a review about a book which became a bestseller and was very successful in Germany. And then I kind of regularly wrote books which were now, I think, unbelievably fair negative reviews of these so-called Russlandversteher, people who understand Russia and who really did not understand Russia but were just defending the policy of the Kremlin. And I was not that active on Twitter. That's indeed where I started. I did join Twitter also in 2015, but I never had a plan. And when the full-scale invasion happened in February 22, I started posting like mad. I never had like a strategy. How do you, as a historian of Ukraine, try to reach the public sphere about what is going on, try to counter pro-Russian narratives? It was an emotional reaction, also I think a reaction from a position of helplessness, because it is also a challenging moment when you see places where you've been with students being bombed. And at the same time, these kind of people in this public sphere saying Ukraine should just surrender and basically accept Russian occupation. But I think that was also something which is part of the story, possibly for many of us, because I'm not the only one who engages in these kind of debates on social media. We're getting into something, at least I can say for myself, I don't really understand. I don't really understand the algorithm. I don't really understand how it works. And I still don't really understand why within a couple of months I suddenly had a following 10,000, 15,000, 20,000, 25,000. But at some point I had this following and I thought, well, now I might as well use it. And now I have a voice and can do something with it to support a country which has been attacked. And I think that's also something maybe which is, especially in Germany, there is a lot of gatekeeping. And for me, I had done a few pieces in the traditional media, but it was more like that the more visible I became on Twitter, the more traditional media would ask me to write for them. And you could say that was the democratic element of the whole thing, because normally a female postdoc with no professor title is not the first address for traditional media houses to ask about what she thinks about what is going on. But for the way you also, I said in the beginning, sometimes things happen you didn't really plan, and of course this is what happens on what was then Twitter. You don't have control of what happens with your tweet that is out there. And I very vividly remember one such tweet, which I wrote in reaction to the first interview with former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder in the New York Times. And I was so annoyed that I wrote a very, one might say aggressive, but I think I still stand by the tweet. It was true what I said, but I wrote it very annoyed. I was alone in Warsaw. My husband was not there. And I wrote it in my laptop, clapped him, put down my notebook, went to bed. And then the next morning it had gone viral. And I was cited with this tweet in Spiegel Online, one of the leading online journals in Germany. And of course not as some user of Twitter, but as Dr. Franziska Davies from Ludwig Maximilian University, Munich. And I was like, ooh, okay. Because then it's out there. And then it's out there, people see it, your fellow academics see it, and they might think, that's not the way we academics put our thoughts to paper. I mean, and I think that's also something which I thought about possibly too late, but I probably wouldn't have changed my behavior anyway. But I also remember thinking I can't remember, maybe May, June 2022, okay, maybe that was it with the academic career. Too many people are now annoyed with me. I've been too aggressive to too many professors. But hey, at least I did what I thought was right. So that's okay. I think what is also something I learned is that there is still, and maybe this is changing, but there is still a traditional view of the public intellectual. This is a tendency. It's not always like that, but of the over 50 male professor who is laid back and does not get emotional or is very analytical, which of course is a construct in itself. And I think it's actually, I don't know, because I don't understand actually how social media works, but I think one of the reasons why people started following me was not only that there was a gap of knowledge about Ukraine, which suddenly became so visible, and I was making an offer basically for information about Ukraine, so I wrote these long threads explaining the history of Ukraine, and I also promoted an online lecture on Twitter, and over 300 people signed up, so I did an online lecture every week about Ukrainian history. But I think another reason was that I was annoyed, and I showed that I was annoyed, and people could identify with that. But then very quickly, and this has been a persistent topic, very often you then get accused of activism. And if you're an activist, you can't be a serious scholar. There's like the tension between these two things. And I personally don't think that's true. Well, I mean, I wouldn't say I'm not an activist. That would be wrong. I mean, clearly I have taken on this role, as I have done others. But if you base it on your knowledge and on your expertise, then it doesn't delegitimize you as a scholar. And I've actually yet to find the person who has shown me in my academic work since then that I'm somehow turned into this crazy activist who can't make a proper argument in an academic paper. And I've also noticed, not always, but there is also a tendency, this reproach that you've become an activist and kind of left the scholarly field is very often formulated by male senior academics who are, let's say, have more sympathies towards Russia than me. And who also, and I think that's really the point, and something I really also think junior academics should think about, to get immediately kind of skeptical if somebody says, professor or not, I'm not an activist, I'm just a scholar, I'm being very rational and analytical, and that crazy woman back there, she's an activist. She's really emotional. Because, I mean, this idea that you have to fulfill a certain way of speaking to be a scholar, I mean, that's also just to say I'm being the rational, analytical person here. It's just a performance act. It doesn't mean you're actually being very analytical and rational, formulating a good argument. So we always look at the arguments. Of course, this is also a very specific event which led to me becoming an activist or entering the public sphere, a genocidal war. So it's not like, actually a professor of economics once said to me, I really feel your frustration when you see kind of people who are not actually very competent speak about your field. We also have that in economics, but I mean, at least it's only economics, it's not a matter of life and death like it is when what you're speaking about. And a good friend and colleague of mine who's a historian actually of the Holocaust, and who's actually also one of the people I met via Twitter and are now friends with. It was very funny when I was at her wedding and people asked me, so how do you know her? And I said, via Twitter. That's how we met. And she always says, if we don't get worked up and emotional about genocide, then who are we? Another, again, obviously not planned challenge was getting taken to court by one of these very vocal pro-Russian propagandists in Germany, this former journalist who managed to kind of build up a career in Germany as a Russia expert, even though she turned into a Kremlin supporter very, very quickly, and who I kept criticizing on Twitter. And at some point she took me to court, and that was, for one, to some extent, even a positive experience, because from my colleagues on an individual level, there was a lot of support, there was a lot of solidarity, and there was a fundraising campaign for my legal costs. There was several fronts in which she tried to silence me, I guess. I mean, I think this is what you call SLAPP, strategic lawsuit against public participation. She tried it on many levels. I can't talk about the details on a different level for legal reasons, but I can say that I had absolutely no institutional support, so no support from the university, to the contrary. And this, of course, is, notwithstanding my case, a problem. If scholars in their field of expertise, and that can be actually many fields, I actually had a professor of medicine call me after an interview and on my office phone and said, I really support you and I really feel you. I know what you're going through after COVID. This whole kind of experience of getting attacked also, that's maybe something, because I don't want to talk too long, we can also speak about. Of course, you also get quite frustrated, aggressive emails, not even to speak of what is posted about you on social media. And then there's also a lot of misogyny. But you see it, so you can't unsee it. But there's also like was also part of the experience, this kind of personal attacks and how to deal with them. But here again, solidarity really helped, because I now have networks after 2022 too, I never had before. So also talking to military experts, talking to people from the cultural field, it's like this war has created networks which should have been there sooner, but they weren't. And some female experts, and there's also we kind of got together and said, okay, and this is also an idea which developed on Twitter, we're going to do an evening about misogyny towards women experts. We did that for the first anniversary of the full-scale invasion, and it was really great because we collected, like we sent everything we had, or more or less everything that we had, from emails and nasty posts and this awful anti-women stuff we sent to the theatre in Hamburg, which is a great theatre, and they made a wonderful evening out of it with actors reading these posts. And it was so great because sometimes it was so funny, like when you have these great actors read these really stupid posts. And then it would just be so funny and also empowering. But then there were moments where we both kind of had tears in our eyes because there was an element of real violence in and then like rape fantasies and things like that in some of these tweets. So yeah, that was another also kind of empowering experience, because when it was a charity event, and the money collected in that evening was then donated to an organization in Ukraine which supports women. And then coming back to activism and scholarship, I mean, for one thing, of course, it also costs time, obviously, to go out there to write articles for the press, and it's not these kind of articles which get you in the next round on the academic in the academic field. And also sometimes, which I've become to find a little, can I put this, a little irritating, is when I meet people at conferences and they kind of look at me and say, do you have any time left for academia? And at the beginning, I started defending myself, and now I think I have a good response. I say, yeah, I still have time for academia. I don't have any time for housework anymore. So that's my standard response to this. But even like, it is true, of course. It is true that time management is affected by it. And of course, if I had just kept my head down and continued writing my habilitation, it would probably be finished by now. It's not finished. It will be finished soon, though. So that's another aspect, and maybe that's also, on a more general level, a challenge. Because I do think we have a responsibility as especially as publicly funded scholars, to give our expertise back. But we're not in the postdoc stage. We're not in secure positions. We're not on fixed contracts. And at some point, if you have a fixed contract, then very often you have so much to do. You have to, have PhD students. You teach a lot. You don't really have the time necessarily to do that. So I think that's also just a challenge we could talk about. This is something I've been also thinking about more recently, and it's actually interesting. It only occurred to me quite recently, is that regularly, I am asked this question: how do you combine, or how do you reconcile your activism with your academic role, with your role as a scholar? Okay, yeah, it's a legitimate question, and I think it's something we can discuss. But I also find it a little unbalanced, that there are people out there who have worked on Russia all their life. I haven't seen really say anything publicly. You could ask these people, how do you reconcile your silence with your role as a scholar? But somehow this doesn't happen that often. At least that's my experience. And maybe the last, because this is actually an interesting aspect, which social media is one on. And I think that I joined Twitter was just, 2015. That was the platform where all the kind of academics and journalists were. We like writing, and you could write, even though only a few spaces, but I learned threads pretty quickly, and so you can write. As Twitter got progressively worse, I started an Instagram account. I'm still kind of struggling with Instagram. I feel very old, and I regularly have to ask a friend of mine, like, how do you do this? I've never joined Facebook, because then I would seriously not get any academic work done anymore. But I also kind of sometimes see that a lot of, like, in this field is also happening in Facebook, because the older the generation of, for example, Russian liberals is on Facebook. So many discussions are taking place there. I'm not really aware of if not somebody tells me about it. But I also maybe had an interesting experience when Vice, which is an NGO, Ukrainian NGO based in Berlin, who've become very important voice for Ukraine and Germany, asked me to do a video for TikTok about how Russia abuses the Second World War in its propaganda. And they sat me down. I mean, they did it very well, like technically and very professional. They said to me, so, okay, Franziska, now you have 2.5 minutes to explain how Russia abuses the Second World War, but better 2 minutes, you know. And then there's this tension. I had my colleagues in the back of my head saying, "That's not. You can't do that as a serious historian. I mean, how can you do that in 2 minutes? It's not serious." But then, okay, if we don't do it, if we say that's kind of beneath, well, not even beneath me, but if we kind of say that's just not enough time. Yeah, that's just not enough time. Then all the pro-Russian stuff on TikTok is just going to take completely over. So I did it. I think I managed it in 2 minutes 20 seconds, and then they edited as you do. They put as they do it, and also not very traditionally academic. They put pictures and music and stuff and put it out there on TikTok. And I didn't look at it for a couple of weeks, and then at some point I looked at it. And I have to say, I felt really old. When I opened this and I looked at this, the whole page, it was just too much. Like videos everywhere, everything moving, everything loud. It's like too much for my brain. And then I looked at my video, and I thought it was quite good. I mean, for 2.5 minutes, it was fine. And then I looked at the comments and thought, okay, in comparison to this, Twitter is like kindergarten. It's very aggressive, very kind of. And that's the last time I took a look at TikTok. And then I also made the decision at some point to just leave X, as it was called then. After Trump was elected for the second time, I left it. I had probably stayed longer than I should have, because I always thought, because at the end I had something like 37,000 followers. And which is also something which, of course, which you can then use. I cooperated twice with NGO in Kiev Defenders, who organize evacuation vehicles for the front line. And I did 2 fundraisers. And the first fundraiser, and also did several other fundraisers, but those were the big ones, via Twitter. And I thought, okay, I'm going to use this as long as it brings me money for Ukraine. But then actually, and it was kind of an experiment, then I did the second fundraiser on Blue Sky and Instagram only, and I thought, if I don't have the 20,000 euros after 3 weeks, I'm going to do Twitter as well, or X. But it worked. So I didn't need X anymore to reach the goal. But yeah, as I said, not really knowing what I'm doing in the end. So 2 weeks ago, somebody introduced me here in Vienna as the German expert on disinformation. I said, no. I mean, I'm a historian. I sit in archives normally. But hey, yeah, that's what happened.